Welcome to tonight's Backyard Forestry. Our presentation tonight is Grassland Bird Habitats on Working Farms. Our guest is Celia Vuocolo, Stewardship Project Director, Agriculture and Wetlands, New Jersey, Audubon. Just a little word about the New Jersey Forestry Association. We are a 501c3 organization. We advocate for all forests in New Jersey by supporting sustainable use and science-based forest management. We are the voice of woodland owners in New Jersey, both public and private. This presentation is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to constitute specific legal, tax, or other advice. No claims, promises, or guarantees are made about its accuracy, completeness, adequacy, or suitability. We encourage landowners to consult with their own attorneys, accountants, and foresters for professional advice concerning their woodlands and otherwise. We've gotten into the habit of giving you an update on legislative and regulatory with these little presentations, but this month we won't be doing that. Instead, we'll be talking a little bit about our upcoming annual meeting, which is our 51st annual meeting. It takes place on March 21st at Rutgers University, and it is entitled The Courage to Care, Elevating the Art of Forest Stewardship. We have a fantastic keynote speaker, nationally known speaker, Paul Catanzaro. He's a professor and state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts. It's a full-day program. It will be chaired by NJFA Director Andrew Bennett. Many of you know him from other backyard forestry presentations, or he may in fact be your forester. It will include noteworthy speakers and panelists, a legislative and regulatory update, and our annual business meeting. 2026 members can register with a discount. Registration includes continental breakfast and a full buffet lunch. So sometimes an important point. I'll introduce you now to Celia. She joined New Jersey Audubon in 2023 and is based out of the Wattles Stewardship Center in Port Murray, Warren County. Celia and her team work with private landowners, other nonprofits, and government agencies to restore freshwater wetlands and grasslands and promote agricultural best management practices, also known as BMPs, for wildlife across New Jersey. In tonight's webinar, we will learn about ways to better manage fields, including working fields, for grassland birds and other wildlife. The presentation will include an overview of what grasslands look like on the East Coast, showcase some of the birds that call this special habitat home, cover real-world habitat management opportunities for a range of field uses, and provide tips for how to assess your property to improve grassland habitats. By the way, these photos are actual New Jersey grasslands. And without further ado, we're pleased to present Grassland Bird Habitats on Working Farms with Celia Vuocolo.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Just give me 1 minute here. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Rich. Thanks for joining me this evening. As Rich mentioned, my name is Celia Vuocolo. I'm the Stewardship Project Director for Agriculture and Wetlands at New Jersey Audubon. I know this presentation is a bit of a departure from the regular programming of backyard forestry, but I know that many of the landowners that I work with have both forest land and fields. So I hope you'll find this information helpful for stewarding your property. I've got a bunch of great information to share, so I'm gonna just go ahead and get started. Whoop, let me see. Of course. There we go. Okay. All right. So here's an overview of what I'll be sharing today. I'm mainly hoping that you're going to walk away with a basic understanding of grassland conservation concepts and some things that you can do on your property to support grassland birds and other wildlife. I'm going to start off with some basics and define what a grassland is, and then describe the special group of birds that live in this habitat. I'm going to wrap it up by spending some time talking about examples of best management practices that benefit grassland biodiversity, and then I'll close things out with some information on resources and technical support. But first, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to my work. New Jersey Audubon is an independent Audubon. We're not affiliated with National Audubon Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was founded in 1897. We are the second oldest Audubon in the country behind Mass Audubon. They beat us by 1 year. We work to engage the citizens of New Jersey through on nature and do so through education, research, and stewardship. So our stewardship department, where I work, works throughout the state on habitat restoration and creation projects. We focus on general wildlife populations as well as species of special conservation concern in New Jersey and beyond, which typically are state and federally listed species. If New Jersey Audubon is going to have a positive impact on wildlife and the landscape in our state, we need to work with and support private landowners. New Jersey Audubon is, first and foremost a wildlife conservation organization, and as such, the stewardship department has focused our efforts on restoring habitat that supports mainly at-risk species. However, we also believe in supporting ecosystems and the services that they provide us, like clean air and water, healthy soil, and climate resilience as well. We promote thoughtful forest management and regenerative agricultural practices to private landowners and farmers through outreach and education programs. And we're doing all this in hopes that it will help to cultivate a conservation ethos in our community where, caring for the land becomes more commonplace. So how do we accomplish these tasks? Well, one of our principal activities is providing technical assistance to landowners. This means giving advice and recommendations on how landowners can accomplish their conservation goals through stewardship activities. However, providing advice is often not enough, and landowners also need financial support to do the work, and many times need someone to help them on the ground as well. That's why we work closely with our partners at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. Many of you may be familiar with them, because they can offer some funding support and even on-the-ground implementation for landowners. I do want to also mention that stewardship staff does hands-on restoration work too, but that work is selective due to staff capacity, and typically is either reliant on grant funding, or sometimes we can employ a fee-for-service scenario where the landowner pays for our services. So now that you know a little bit more about my work, let's talk about grasslands. So grasslands can be found on almost every major continent on Earth. They are referred to as prairies, meadows, savannas, early successional habitat, plains, fields, etc. They have a lot of different names. Grasslands are the most threatened but least protected biome on the planet. This is because they are easily converted to other forms of land use or developed, or in some cases, succeed into forest. This is a problem because they support a significant part of our agriculture, which would be livestock production. Harvested grass is also used for agricultural products like mulch, biofuel, and compost. Grasslands are also under-recognized as a carbon sink. A lot of attention gets paid to the carbon sequestration of forests, but worldwide, grasslands store about a third of all global terrestrial carbon stocks. Lastly, the biodiversity that exists in grassland habitats is important to our livelihood because nature is essential for human life. However, 1/3 of North American species considered endangered are found in grasslands and at risk. So as a guild, grassland birds are declining faster than any other group of birds in North America. The numbers are pretty staggering. 3/4 of all grassland bird species have experienced significant declines in their populations, meaning that there's almost no grassland bird that hasn't been majorly impacted in the last 50 years by habitat loss and fragmentation. And that's what is the leading cause of decline for this species, is that habitat loss. 360 million acres of historic grasslands have been lost from North America. So this means that in order to support grassland birds, pollinators, reptiles, amphibians, other wildlife that rely on grassland habitat, we need to acknowledge that agricultural lands are often surrogate habitat for these species and manage what we can to support them. Private lands, especially in the East, hold the key to many species survival, not just grassland birds. 61% of the US is in private hands, which is a conservation opportunity. Not only do we have the ability to move the needle and bring species back from the brink of extinction, but by supporting nature on our farms and our properties, we can make our agriculture more productive and our land healthier in the process. And more on that later. I thought I'd take a moment and just define what a grassland is. As I mentioned, grasslands are one of the largest biomes, which means a landscape that contains plants, animals, certain soil characteristics, climate, etc., on the planet. So they're one of the largest biomes on the planet. And simply put, grasslands are open and continuous areas of land with few to no trees, dominated by grasses. There's a lot of different variations of grasslands, and they can be natural or man-made. On the East Coast, our historic landscape did contain savannas and grassland, and less than 10% of our historic grasslands remain. There's always been a lot of conversation about how the East Coast has been, historically in forest land, but we're finding now through some very recent research in the last 10 to 20 years that in fact we did have some remnant grassland and savannas in the East. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the positive and negative benefits of cool season and warm season grasslands today. So I'm just going to define what that means exactly. So those terms refer to how grasses photosynthesize. And it allows us to think of grasses in terms of what time of year they're actively growing. So cool season grasses that are found in grasslands and ag fields are kind of like your typical turf grasses that mainly have European origins. It's a bit of a generalization, however, because there are native grasses like sedges, etc., that are cool season grasses. But for argument's sake, for the purposes of today, when I mention cool season grasses, I'm referring to kind of these like pasture and turf grass situations that are non-native. Warm season grasses, on the other hand, grow at the height of summer. So these are predominantly native grasses that mostly grow in bunch form. Some other non-native warm season grasses that you may know of include things like crabgrass and Bermuda grass, etc. So just to kind of summarize, cool season grasses are growing in the spring and then again in the fall, and then warm season grasses growing in the summer. So this is a photo of what I think of as kind of a classic hayfield that you can see around New Jersey. I took this photo actually in Clinton Township in Hunterdon County. A cool season field like this is primarily composed of tall fescue, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, etc. These grasses were introduced to the US in the 1800s, early 1900s, because they were thought to extend the grazing season for livestock. Many historic grasslands with warm season grasses were converted to these cool season grasses, and forest land was also cleared and seeded with these species. Now, cool season grasses are not optimal habitat for most wildlife. It doesn't mean you won't see wildlife using them, but in terms of biodiversity that exists in native warm season grasslands, it really doesn't come close. This is due to the non-native cool season grasses' ability to support insect life, because insects are one of those backbone animal groups of a food pyramid that's really important for other wildlife. They don't really provide a lot of diversity of seeds for food or provide adequate cover. So here in contrast is a warm season grass field that's been recently restored. This photo was taken in Warren County in late May, so you can see that many of the grasses are actively growing but haven't reached full height yet. There are very few actual native grassland remnants left in New Jersey, so when grasslands are restored, they are typically seeded with some combination of the native grasses that you see up here on the screen. But in reality, there are many more native grasses that probably existed here in New Jersey, just we have very few that are commercially available for restoration. Native grasslands in the East, more often than not, have a wildflower component. They're not the same as like those really extensive tall season prairie grasses in the Midwest that we often think about when we're thinking about grasslands in the United States. What we have in the East is a little bit different in composition. The types of wildflowers that can be found in New Jersey in a New Jersey grassland are also pretty extensive. I just have kind of a list of some of the usual suspects up here, but you can get a pretty nice diversity in a lot of fields. When comparing this slide to the last one, I'm sure one of the first things you'll recognize is the diversity of plant height and structure in the two photos. That's what makes native grasslands so valuable for wildlife. One of the things, I should say. There are places to nest and hide from predators. The diversity of plant life supports a diversity of insects for food, of course. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention shrublands in this talk. So shrublands are also in that kind of larger family of grasslands. They're referred to sometimes as shrub scrub or early successional habitat. They have a grass and a wildflower component typically, but they also contain some shrubs and even a few scattered short trees. There's a very specific suite of birds, shrubland birds, that use habitat like this. Shrub scrub birds will either nest in thick grasses or wildflower areas or in the shrubs themselves. Shrublands are really challenging to manage and to keep in an arrested state. They're in a constant state of succession. They're striving to be forest, but they can be seen throughout our landscape and often exist side by side with hayfields, pasture, and restored grasslands, and definitely have their place in the landscape. So I selected some photos of a few identifiable grassland birds for you here, but there's at least 15 species of birds in New Jersey that use some type of grassland or early successional habitat in their life cycle. Pretty much all of the species on this slide are listed as state endangered, threatened, or special concern, and are experiencing some kind of population decline. You may recognize, and I hope you do, some birds that maybe frequent your own property or farm. One of the challenges of supporting grassland birds is that there are so many and they have different preferences for what type of grassland they like. For example, the eastern meadowlark that we have up here in the top right does really well in cool season grass hayfields, but you won't find an indigo bunting, which is the bright blue bird in the bottom, using that habitat. They really like shrubland or native grasslands with a lot of wildflowers. Additionally, you even have some species like the red-winged blackbird here at the top of the slide that aren't true grassland species. We call them facultative species because they use multiple habitat types, but they do frequently visit grassland habitat as well. Back that up a little bit. For landowners and farmers that are really into supporting as many species of birds as possible, the recommendation is to manage for a mosaic of different grassland types across the landscape, if it's possible on your farm. If you have a hayfield and you're employing specific BMPs to support birds, maybe you do a little grassland restoration, maybe you have a soft edge or a shrubby hedgerow, and it's all kind of existing within the same connected landscape, that will support a lot of different kinds of birds and wildlife. The building blocks of habitat and the ability for a wildlife species to thrive and reproduce is based really on the availability of certain features in the landscape. I mean, that's true for any wildlife. Grassland birds in particular are limited by space, and I'll talk about that in a minute, food availability and cover, as well as nesting opportunities. So if these features are present on your property, grassland birds will take up residence there. So space is arguably the most significant limiting factor for grassland birds. So it's estimated that grassland and shrubland birds need at least 20 acres of contiguous open habitat with next to no trees. So they're very picky about how their landscape is. Is it open? Is it interrupted by trees? If there's trees or, a field edge or a fence row, that's pretty dense with trees and it's breaking up the landscape, they may or may not use that field. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to personally own 20 acres of open land to see grassland birds. Landscape context is really, really important for this group of birds. So if your property is small, maybe you have like a 5 or 10 acre grassland or hayfield, but it's nestled in an area where with a lot of other open fields and pasture, you're still going to be probably seeing grassland birds on your property and can still manage for them because of that connectivity. So when thinking about whether or not your property can support grassland birds, you're going to need to look beyond your property lines. I've got an example here of an Audubon property. This is the Vuocolo Stewardship Center in Warren County where I work. Most of our open land is leased to a local farmer for annual crops. We have one 11-acre grassland, a restored grassland that sits next to like a 4-acre shrubland. You can kind of see that on the top of the map there. I have yet to see true obligate grassland birds on our site, despite having a restored meadow. I'll sometimes see some like shrubland birds occasionally. I think this is because we don't have enough contiguous acreage near this field, and it's surrounded by, you can see on there, a dense tree line and some forested acreage. I will point out that Audubon has found through research that small grains can support some grassland species if they're adjacent to other grassland fields, but corn and soybeans will not. So as you may have guessed, grassland birds mainly consume seeds from grasses and flowers, but they also consume a lot of insects. Some species will eat fruit like berries, plant matter, but the predominant food sources are seeds and bugs. Food and energy needs vary for grassland birds depending on the time of year, what life stage they're in, which is the same for all birds. For example, fledglings will eat a lot of insects because they need energy for growth, and this is usually happening in the springtime. Overwintering birds tend to forage on seeds or berries because that's what's available at that time. Food availability is directly tied to plant diversity. So the majority of insects in grassland systems are herbivores, so they're also eating plants. So without a lot of different kinds of plants, particularly native plants, you won't have a lot of bugs. This is often where cool season grass fields kind of fall short a bit because those grasses don't support a lot of different kinds of insects. Cover is significant as well, and grassland birds need it for a number of scenarios. They need cover for themselves, their young from hiding from aerial predators in the growing season, but they also need protection during the winter months. Many grassland birds migrate south for the winter, but not all. We actually have some winter migrants that hang with us from more northern climates. So warm season grasses have a really rigid structure, as do many of the flowers that grow in the fields alongside them. These grasses are more likely to stay upright in the winter months as opposed to cool season grasses, which will flop over in the snow and the wind. So this is a really important feature for grassland birds. Grassland birds typically nest on or near the ground, sometimes in the base of grass clumps, and this makes them pretty vulnerable to predators and also land management activities. Shrubland birds usually nest in shrubs, also in grasses, or even some of the short trees. Many of my upcoming best management practices focus on eliminating or trying to mitigate nest destruction through land management activities, since it is the main driver behind grassland bird decline that we are actually able to control on a property by property basis. So, and just mention real briefly here, there are a handful of birds that are cavity nesters that also frequent grasslands. You can put out nest boxes for, and I have a whole separate slide that will talk about those guys. So I'm sure at this point in the presentation, you've probably started thinking about whether your farm or your property might be able to support grassland birds. I'm sure that we have a diversity of folks here today with a lot of different kinds of production systems or properties. There may be scenarios like the one pictured here in this graphic where maybe your focus and energy is directed towards your commercial crop, or maybe it's a woodland. But perhaps you have a fallow field or two, kind of like the one pictured here on the left side of the graphic, that maybe you mow or hay once a year for farmland assessment and just kind of forget about. That could be being used by grassland birds. So let's talk about some of the steps for setting up management practices. The first thing when you're considering grassland habitat management is to see whether you have the right features to support grassland birds. So this includes kind of thinking about some of the things we've already discussed, assessing what your surrounding landscape looks like. Are you adjacent to more farm fields? Are you surrounded by forest? Do you have enough acreage, et cetera, to support grassland birds? The next step is to see what you're already doing that may be benefiting birds. Many of the BMPs that I'm going to talk about may be things you're already doing, which would be great. If you're not maximizing what's possible, consider adopting some of these BMPs, maybe even working with a professional like myself or our staff or someone at NRCS possibly as well, to enroll in a cost share program to help support your efforts and plan out your goals. So I'm going to start with the simplest and most basic, and tends to be a pretty common one as well, which is just managing an existing fallow or old ag field for wildlife. So this could be something where maybe it was a horse pasture at some point in time, you no longer have horses, it's maybe 2 or 3 acres, something along those lines. The recommendations I have here are not necessarily for old fields that are being hayed. I have information on haying a little bit later on. This is really for areas that have grown up and were farmed at some point anymore. These could also be large areas of your lawn that you are regularly mowing and maybe just don't want to anymore. So for sites like these, the recommendation is to first mow, split it into thirds, and mow a third of the field each year. This is to ensure that some of the vegetation is left standing for the winter months, and you're only mowing once a year. Managing for any invasive species in the fields is really critical. So like I said, mowing is happening once a year on a third. It's a third, a third, and a third between February 1st and April 1st. And we recommend this window because mowing during this time period will have the least amount of impact to wildlife. So mowing in the spring and the summer is really impactful to wildlife and insects. That's one of the most active times for them. Flowers are blooming, bees are out and about. Mowing in the fall is probably the second best option, but still not ideal because it could remove potential winter habitat that's really critical for wildlife during the harshest times of the year. So, if you're mowing the field multiple times a year, stop doing that, save yourself some gas. And if you want to manage that field for wildlife, the only reason to mow it is to really knock back any trees that might become established. And that's it, once a year.
Celia, could I just jump in a second? One thing that we could point out is that NRCS, in their ranking systems, when you make an application with them for reimbursement, one of the programs they have is delayed mowing. in fact.
Yes.
So that
Yeah.
this is consistent with that program. And that's another element you can add to your application to increase the likelihood you will be a winner when when the lottery takes place, in essence, when the evaluation takes place. So anyway, that's this is an asset when applying to NRCS.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I have a slide a little bit later on that just talks about NRCS and kind of working with them to talk through your different goals. And, you know, especially if you're putting in an application because you're planning on doing some forestry activities and you've got these fields and, you know, you just can think, hey, I heard you have a cost share practice for delayed haying or delayed mowing. Can I add that into my application? And that's a really great way to just get reimbursed for this activity. And yeah, like Rich said, you know, the ranking questions for whose, you know, applications get selected for funding change every year, but by and large, the more diverse, I would say is the word, conservation practices you sign up for, the stronger your application does tend to be. So, yeah, and like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And this one as well, grassland restoration, where you're actually going in and restoring a native grassland. There is also cost share available for all of these steps through NRCS. So I could do an entire presentation just on grassland restoration, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about, but I'm just going to do my best to give you kind of a short and sweet version because I'm giving you like a menu of different things here in this presentation. So restoring a section of your property to native grasses and flowers is, you know, the number one best thing you can do for grassland birds, for sure. But it requires patience, usually working with a professional, and even more patience. It's a step-by-step process that can take 2 to 4 years, typically, until you really see a finished product. It requires that the existing vegetation, whatever it is eradicated first or removed, which can take a while. But you don't want to shortchange that step. You really want to make sure that your ground is prepared in order to go ahead and seed it. Ordering a seed mix can be a bit tricky. Working with a native seed is different from other types of plant seeds. So that's why working with a conservation professional on a project like this is really recommended. You'll need to think through, you know, do I need to rent or borrow equipment? Am I hiring a contractor? You'll also want to figure out what your plan is to manage the grassland once it's established. And you want to do that ahead of time because grasslands require regular maintenance to stay in grassland and not succeed into forest. So I hope that I didn't discourage anyone. You know, it's a really amazing thing to restore a bit of earth there, but it is a complex process. And a good way to start is by, you know, maybe just trying out the techniques on a smaller area first. So the farm systems that are, you know, most likely to have the biggest impact on grassland birds are typically the grazing and haying operations. The good news is that sustainable grazing practices that are good for cattle and forage health are also good for birds. There's plenty of research out there that really shows an alignment with those three things. So you have livestock or you're haying and are already doing a lot of these things, you know, you're already well on your way. Most grazing systems in, you know, North America are built on cool season grasses. We've already talked about that a little bit. There are some grassland birds like the bobolink and eastern meadowlark who will use cool season fields. The key, if you're a livestock producer, if you want to support grassland birds, is to ensure that you're not overgrazing the fields, and that you're having some areas of grass that are at least 6 inches tall or higher at various points in the year. Just remember, this is all about providing cover and nesting opportunities for birds, especially cover in the winter as well. And of course, you know, incorporating warm season grasses for grazing is highly recommended. So this would end up being a much smaller percentage of your overall grazable acreage, something like 10 to 25% of your overall grazable acreage could be warm season grasses. And, a lot of warm season grasses are excellent forage for cattle and other livestock, especially during the summer slump once those cool season grasses stop growing. Lastly, I can't say enough about stockpiling, which is essentially setting aside a field in the growing season and allowing it to grow up and then letting your livestock graze it in the winter as opposed to feeding them hay. Stockpiling fields, it's a great way to save on hay costs. And it's essentially just standing hay. And it sets aside a portion of your acreage as well for birds to use. Oh yeah, there I had it. Sorry about that. Yeah, 10 to 25%. Yeah, sounds good. So I have some recommended grass heights here for grazing, and these heights are beneficial to both birds as well as forage health because they incorporate these kind of considerations for not grazing below the growing points of the grass, which can damage the plant, but also not provide enough adequate cover for grassland birds. I will mention though that these are, your minimum heights here. So turnout height's about 6 inches for cool season. Warm season grazing turnout height is about 15 inches. So a lot taller for warm season grasses because they have a much higher, where the growing points of the grass are. But yeah, livestock trampling nests, that can be a source of mortality for grassland birds. Certainly mob grazing systems can intensify this issue, but there's also research out there that says it's not always a problem. I think it sort of just depends on your issue and how much acreage you have. And also, what your stocking density is. So grassland birds can do just fine in rotational grazing systems if the stocking density is appropriate. Generally speaking, it's 1 to 2 head of cattle per acre is a typical good stocking density for grassland birds. I wanted to point out too, real quick, that this photo is from one of Duke Farms cattle pastures. If y'all are familiar with Duke Farms, they've been successfully grazing cattle at low stocking rates in fields with milkweed and other flowers without any toxicity issues. And we're starting to see a greater increase in research supporting this idea that diverse forage that includes wildflowers like this does not negatively affect cattle. So crop systems as well. There's another one. Sorry about that. I didn't realize I split those up. Crop systems can be maximized to support insects and wildlife as well as some shrubland birds. So we frequently recommend restoring these kind of hard to farm areas to warm season grasses and flowers. This can enhance nearby habitat features as well as just improve overall biodiversity and soil health on your farm. There's also cost share programs through USDA, NRCS, and the Farm Service Agency that can help offset the financial costs of removing these areas from production. Cover cropping is another practice that we highly recommend, not a straight tie to grassland birds, but just an overall good ag B&P to practice. And it's a great one to promote beneficial insects and soil health overall. Okay, so here's the nest box slide here. I'm sure, many of you have seen nest boxes or perhaps have some installed on your property. If so, that's wonderful. We get tons of questions at Audubon about nest boxes, and they're certainly very popular. I'm just going to highlight 2 species today that are beneficial to have on a farm setting and use nest boxes as well. And those are the American kestrel. So it's that larger bird down there in the corner, really beautiful, striking bird. It's a small raptor. And then, of course, the eastern bluebird. You may have other beneficial birds using bluebird boxes like swallows or wrens, which is fine too, but you definitely want to evict any starlings or European sparrows from your nest boxes if possible, because they will outcompete the bluebirds. So these species normally would use hollowed out trees right on a fence line to build their nests in. So in the absence of those natural features, you can install these boxes. Boxes can be built or purchased online. There's a lot of easily accessible information about correct dimensions and materials that you can find. For bluebirds, nest boxes don't have to be too high off the ground. 4 to 6 feet is usually fine. Don't put them on trees or placed near woods. The squirrels will move in. They should be placed about 200 feet apart. I think that's a little bit big of a gap. I've seen them work just fine, like 50 feet apart from each other. It really depends on your space, and you can kind of experiment with what works. Bluebirds are really phenomenal insect hunters and are just fantastic to have on your farm. So with kestrels, they really like their space. So more than likely, you're going to have maybe space for one box. I mean, I've seen anywhere from they like one box for 8 acres, one box for 25 acres. I mean, I think it's a little bit all over the place, but they definitely, you don't need a lot of them. There were boxes require a little bit more work and thought because you're going to need to mount them on a pole that's at least 12 feet off the ground. The higher, the better. But kestrels are really excellent at pest control and will readily hunt small rodents. So they're another fantastic bird to have. So the last BMP I wanted to cover is for haying. Haying is the trickiest, and it's probably the most impactful agricultural activity for grassland birds. And this is mainly due to the timing of this activity. But, also haying, it's removing vegetation in its totality from a field. So there's really not a lot of habitat left on the ground. So haying coincides with the height of grassland bird nesting season, which runs from April 1st to August 1st in New Jersey. Haying during the nesting season has been found to result in an over 90% loss in nests. So mortality is pretty high. Delaying haying is really the best way to avoid nest mortality, but it can come at a cost to the farmer. So if the hay that is being used to feed livestock or horses and not for something like mulch or compost, what tends to happen is over time, the nutritional quality of the hay decreases as the summer goes on and tends to not meet, nutritional or palatability needs of horses, finishing beef or calving dairy. However, late season hay can be sold in other markets for certain livestock, mushroom production, mulch, bedding, and compost. This is a really great graphic that was produced by the Smithsonian from Virginia. So our grassland birds are pretty much on the same timeline, maybe a week or two off. Just want to point out too that about 80% of the first clutch of nests will fledge by July 1st. So typically most grassland birds will, if they're allowed to, will raise 2 separate clutches of eggs. And the first one's usually, depending on the species, fledging by July 1st, but we do have some species that will fledge later, like bobolinks. If you're unable to avoid the grassland bird nesting season during haying, there are some other steps you can take to help offset the impacts a little bit. Definitely, mowing your field at 8 inches or higher. This could help avoid, some nests or other ground-dwelling animals like the eastern box turtle that are out and about at that time. You can mount a flushing bar to the front of your tractor. You can mow starting in the center of your field, kind of working your way outward. And these last 2 points, both of these practices will hopefully allow birds some time to escape. So, when I'm working with farmers to incorporate grassland bird BMPs into their ag systems, I'm always aiming for diversity in terms of diversity of practices, but also, feasibility. I think incorporating 1 or 2 BMPs is a good place to start, but it also has to make sense with your production system. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to maintain it. But addressing different trouble spots throughout your farm operation will result an overall increase in biodiversity, soil health, and pest reduction over time. So finding ways to mitigate nest mortality for grassland birds while keeping a viable haying system is a really tough nut to crack. Many conservation organizations across the East Coast that I work with are looking into ways to kind of bridge that gap for the farmers. I'd say high on that list is, developing avenues for alternative hay products. So selling that less nutritious hay that's hay later in the season to protect birds. They can sell it in other markets, or also thinking through some pretty substantial financial incentives to kind of make up for that loss that they would receive from having maybe lower quality hay. So I know I gave you a lot of information, but we have resources. I have resources for you, support. Definitely don't have to figure this out alone. We're here to help. In New Jersey, I think we're fairly lucky. I mean, we've got some nonprofit organizations as well as government agencies that can kind of provide technical support for conservation planning, but also cost share money to implement some of these practices. So you can choose, how you wish to proceed. So in terms of just advice and technical assistance, which means kind of coming out to your property, talking about your goals and making a plan, New Jersey Audubon, ourselves, North Jersey RC&D, the Xerces Society has a biologist in South Jersey, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife are all available just for technical assistance. If you're looking for technical support and a financial incentive in some way, most of these, folks can help, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife in particular has what's called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. There's no money involved, but they can provide materials like seed mixes and trees, plus actual labor to do some of the habitat practices. But I have to say, of course, lion's share of financial support for wildlife work comes from Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. NRCS staff or partner biologists, and at Audubon we have a NRCS partner biologist, can help plan a project out and see if you're eligible to receive cost share for any of your work. So just real briefly, I'm going to close out the presentation by just kind of talking through some of these different programs that can help with some grassland bird work. The first one is EQIP, and most folks are familiar with that. Funding from this program comes from the Farm Bill. There's cost share funding for ag activities, conservation activities, practices through reimbursement. You'll first need to find your local service center, see if you're eligible for funding, have them come out do a site visit. You're going to be required to, sign a contract, follow a schedule of activities. Application deadlines are usually once a year in the fall, although sometimes they do more than one application deadline depending on what's going on with funding. And like I mentioned before, when Rich popped on, if you're already got an application in the works, and even if you just put one in this fall, they're still working through the process of ranking and planning them out right now. You could, ask them to pop in a delayed haying practice, or, they also have cost share for nest boxes. So nest boxes could be something that could be cost shared, as well as, planting field buffers, doing grassland restoration, et cetera, et cetera. So the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, is kind of, in my mind, like the next step up from EQIP. EQIP is kind of like the fix-it program in some ways, where it's tackling a problem, and CSP kind of helps you continue to maintain that restoration. And it's really well suited for people who have, been through EQIP already and have done some of that restoration work and just kind of need that financial support to keep those projects going. I will say that the payment setup is different from EQIP. And CSP does require you to kind of enroll your entire property, but it's very useful if you need to kind of have that support continuation. And the last program I have here is the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, or SAFE. So this is administered through the Farm Service Agency, which housed in the same service center as NRCS. It's administered by FSA, but NRCS manages the contracts. It's specifically intended for crop systems, and CRP contracts can last up to 15 years, and the idea is that it incentivizes farmers to remove kind of more like environmentally sensitive land from production that's also not producing a whole lot because it's too wet, it's too something that it just doesn't want to do well in crops. So this also helps to kind of improve the farmer's bottom line because, like I said, these areas are typically hard to farm anyway, don't produce a lot of money. So this is a good way to kind of balance all of that. You would receive cost share to restore these areas to native habitat, and then you would get kind of what they call rental payments to keep these areas out of production. So here's an example of a kestrel box at Duke Farms. That's my little one, Maddie. And as you can see, it's pretty tall. So, I mean, those kestrels really like to be pretty high up there. And the last thing I'll say before we have any questions is that I will be at the NJFA annual meeting at the Audubon table if anyone wants to kind of stop by and chat about your property in more detail. So.
Well, thank you so much, Celia. That was just a great and comprehensive presentation. You actually answered a ton of the questions that were out there. And I kept looking at the questions and trying to memorize them, so I'd come back to them, and then you answered it. But there are a few still out there, so I thought we'd go through them.
Sure.
And make sure we're answering. The other thing I want to know about that box is, how do you get up there to clean it? This is a very, very interesting question. But
probably a ladder. Probably a ladder involved, I think.
So I don't know if I'm catching you in your own acronym or not, but there's a question here. What is the NJRC&D?
Oh, yes. No, that's fair. I had to, I think, abbreviate a lot of other technical service providers on that slide. So that's North Jersey RC&D. So that's North Jersey, Resource and Conservation. I forget what their whole name is. I feel so bad because they're a wonderful partner. But they're, here to support farmers in North Jersey. And they actually have, they're another nonprofit as well, but they have some of their own cost share programs that landowners can apply directly through them for.
Okay. I'm just looking them up online. North Jersey Resource Conservation and Development.
Development. I always forget what the D stands for. Okay.
That tricky D. And I wanted to give an award. We have somebody on from Cancun, so long distance award. And
wonderful.
Down through the questions. It's a person who's converting a 31-acre former veggie farm to pasture for livestock. Well, first of all, the thing we learned tonight is that it's the right size, being more than 10 acres, right?
Sure,
So
yeah.
And any advice on how to accomplish, maybe that would be something to call in one of these consultants you've put on the list.
Yeah, that would be a really great place to start with NRCS, because they also, I often talk about them just in the realm of like wildlife conservation, but they have a lot of practices to support those kinds of agricultural activities. So if they're just thinking about needing assistance for seeding pastures, I mean, that's something that they do as well.
But they do a great job. They really do an amazing job of coming out to help you. And the other thing is you can go visit their offices, and they're very generous with their time. And if you are going to work with them, get into their system in advance and get registered so that you don't have to be overwhelmed by documentation when you want to move forward, because you need to get in, just if there's a document just to get into their entered in their system and things like that. And but definitely they're a great resource. They will also be at the meeting on the 21st of March. So they will have several people there, and they're hugely interactive with folks. So that's a good one. I'm just looking down the list here. Height of mowing, you covered in great detail. There was an interesting question here. There was an answer given by somebody on the call, but I'm not sure. It says, are you saying that only 1/3 of the field is mowed each year so that 2/3 would not get grown in a given year? What is that split that you were talking about?
Yes, and as I was saying it, I was like, oh gosh, I feel like I'm going to confuse people because it's kind of a tricky thing to explain. So I'm glad they asked that question. Yeah, I mean, it is literally that if you just think about it in terms of like a rectangle and it's split into thirds, you're just mowing one section every year. And then as you're going through, you are going to have two-thirds of that field just hanging out, but they're going to be in different states of succession as well, which also has its
Sure.
benefits in terms of like plant diversity and things like that. So yeah, that is essentially what you're. Now, I will say one caveat is that I have been to sites specifically in South Jersey that are very productive for trees for whatever reason, that soil type, like sweet gum, for instance, and we actually had to shift our management strategy. We could not do it over the course of 3 years because they would just grow up too quickly. So don't, live and die by that. If you're seeing trees come up, within that time span, like feel free to do it a little bit more frequently, maybe cut it in half and do it one side every other year. So yeah, just kind of keep that in mind. As long as there's something standing in the winter in that field for wildlife, that's really what you're going for.
Yeah, I apologize if I'm putting you on a technical spot here, and feel
No,
free
that's
to
okay.
say, there's a question that was asked in the registration. What fertilizers are toxic to birds and other wildlife?
That's a really good question. I would say what I have found, and just is that those ones that you can purchase at Home Depot that are like a fertilizer and an herbicide like mixed together, where there's like two different things happening in the product, and it's like, you're throwing it out. That's particularly toxic for birds because they're, always on the ground picking up grit, things like that. So they're ingesting, fertilizer, but then also straight herbicide at the same time. So those kinds of products can be really risky. And any, over the counter fertilizer that is like really high in nitrates, then they could get like nitrate poisoning and it's all about them consuming it, out there in the landscape because it's just kind of sitting on the ground.
Just running through the list. I apologize for any delay. Okay, so going further down, let's see. If I was interested in converting a cool season grass field to a warm season grass field, how would I go about doing that?
Yeah. It's I know I just had like one slide on that. It's definitely a process and it's something that even if you don't want to do cost share or anything like that and go down that whole road, just getting some technical assistance from like here at Audubon or any of the other organizations I mentioned, the Xerces Society, because it really is a process. I mean, you're dealing with removing. So if it's a cool season field, there are organic ways to remove sod. It takes a very long time. It's usually a lot of tilling, but most of the time you're dealing with some sort of herbicide to kill off the existing vegetation. And then you have to really prepare the seed bed well. Using a no-till drill on the back of a tractor, you got to find a no-till drill. There's a couple of places you can get those at to rent. And yeah, so then you got to order the seed mix. So there's all these different steps and there's a lot of timing that's involved with it. So definitely something you want to talk to, I would say, a professional about
Have
first.
you have you observed any invasive battles going on when people try to convert to
Yes.
habitat grasslands?
Yeah. That is a really tricky one. And sometimes too, where you can have a field that just looks like an old hayfield and you don't see anything. And then you start, agitating the soil. We all know that that's usually when the invasives come in and there's a seed bank there and all of a sudden that's coming up in the middle of it. So it can become really tricky really fast because you could just from the acts of disturbance that it takes to do the
Yeah.
seeding.
So I just don't want people to assume that it's going to stay pure grass,
Right.
that they have to realize they're going to be on that invasives front. No matter what happens, Jersey is very prone to it. You'll
Very
find
much.
autumn olive and Russian olives creeping in at those field edges and things of
Yeah.
that nature. And certainly barberry popping up. And it's
Yeah.
something you're going to have to battle. as you leave fields to grow more naturally.
Yes, that is
So
100%.
we do have to recognize there's like a responsibility to do that work. And the results can be
Yes.
great, but it takes a lot of focus and a lot of attention.
It does. And it's very easy for it to get away from you quickly. And there's some really uglies in terms of just like your herbaceous invasives. Like mugwort is one of the most difficult plants to deal with in a grassland setting. Once it takes over Cerecia lespedeza, Chinese bush clover, that's another one that it really can turn the tables on like a restoration project. And yeah, I mean, it's something too where I think I mentioned in one of the slides, like if you're going to do a grassland restoration, make sure you know how you're going to manage it on the backside, because moving forward, you need to have that plan in place. I've been to so many sites where that wasn't discussed ahead of time and like it just got away from it and people get really disappointed and turned off. And it's, you just got to have all those things in place and try to, adaptive management is kind of like the name of the game a lot of
Yep,
times.
absolutely. Any words of encouragement to people with those smaller fields that
Yeah.
I don't want them to be turned off just because,
Yes.
there's a magic number 10 acres. I think it's important, as you said, what's adjacent to the field, what is your
Yeah.
locale, and the general topography. So maybe you can touch on that a little bit. Being the question actually being is, does managing a smaller lot still have value?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and I always have that in the back of my mind when I do presentations like this, because when you're just thinking about grassland birds, which is just one guild of birds, and like you're managing specifically for them, they have all their needs and things, but smaller fields can have value to a lot of other wildlife. I mean, even just the shrubland birds, I didn't talk too much about what their needs are, but like shrubland birds can hang out on like 20 acres or less a lot of times too. They do better in like these larger systems, but, and not even just thinking about birds, it's also pollinators. It's also like, reptile, eastern box turtle is a species that relies on all different kinds of fields and it doesn't really need it to be this big thing. So, yeah, I mean, certainly keep that in mind that like it is worthwhile just any spot that you have to just manage for native plants, just try and do the right thing, I think is a good
Yeah, there's
way.
a follow-up question about wild turkey population. And do they
Yeah,
compete with grassland birds? But they're also another feature of our area up here north,
they
where
do.
even small fields will see wild turkey. So,
Exactly.
so there's
Yeah.
another value to those fields. So I think we've gone down the list. I hope we haven't missed anybody. But if we've missed anybody, please come to our annual meeting and talk to Celia there.
Yeah.
And if anybody hasn't registered yet, please do. And we thank you so much for a presentation that was not only informative, but like I said, covered most of the questions during the presentation. So I say great job. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.